Welcome back. Hope the quiz went well yesterday. We should be able to finish up this chapter by Monday, so that means that we would have the test on Tuesday. Most likely it'll be a shorter test, maybe 35 questions or so. But let me know if you have any questions. If you don't, let's get into today's lesson. So we've looked at most of the people of this chapter, but what about the laws that help change society? Or what about the laws within society? Literally, some of these changes helped form and shape our society today. In the 1870s, the 1920s, there was this foundation that gets laid for the 2000s. You may ask, well, what about the years in between and how did that affect us? They did. They definitely did affect us. But in the late 1920s, America gets put on hold due to the Great Depression, and as we recover in the late 1930s, there's going to be yet another world threat. Germany, from 1945 to the 1990s, we're fighting against communism within Russia as well as the rest of the world. And I think that in the 2000s, we pick back up on much of what began in the 1900s. I think it's cool to see history linked together, but anyways, there was a new law in town, and this is the Sherman Antitrust Act. This act was created to stop businesses from becoming too powerful. I'm sure that most of you have probably played the most time-consuming game in the world, Monopoly. And everyone has their own rules by how they play within Monopoly. Many people have their own strategy, but the purpose of this game is to control more than your opponents. And once you control more than your opponents, you can control your opponent and crush them and their business while yours prospers. Well, this was a real life principle, and the government was scared. They were scared that people like Rockefeller would be able to use his potential power to crush even their own government. In the game of Monopoly, you are allowed to start building once you control all of one color. Then you get a monopoly. In life, when you control one whole area of a business, boom, you have a monopoly. So for example, if one company controlled all of the internet, as opposed to there being AT&T and Charter and Comcast and Verizon and all of the different internet providers that there were, if it was just one company, like let's just say it was just AT&T, they would have a monopoly on internet. They'd be able to control significant portions of the American population just based on allowing the internet or pricing the internet or different things like that. So that's what the Sherman Antitrust Act is for. It's there to stop businesses from being able to control a single area. So what did people do to protect themselves? Well, they united. Get it? They united because they formed the Knights of the Labor Union. Unite, night. Well, anyways, they formed what is called a labor union. This is where employees of a business all agree to stick together no matter what the cost is. That includes firing or pay lowering or different things like that. And the strength of a union is in the numbers. Some people are not allowed to unionize in America, as it's called today. Others are encouraged to do it. It just depends on what state you live in for what the rules on unionizing are. Now, I am not part of any union, but many teachers in Chicago are. When the teachers feel like not enough is being done for them, they can go on strike. If you have enough teachers that go on strike, they can't all be fired. In education, this affects the students. It quickly halts the system, and the boss, or in the education case, the board of education, they have to act quickly. This was the first influential union in America, the Knights of Labor were. They played a key role in several different areas. The first one was the 8-hour workday. Before the Knights of Labor managed to pass this, work days would stretch anywhere between 10 and 14 hours. They'd also have to work 6 days a week. Today, some people do work 12-hour shifts, but they usually do it 4 days and then get 3 days off. And that's just called 4 days on, 3 days off. The second thing that they managed to do was create laws that dealt with child labor, not making it illegal, but instead making it safer for children to be able to work, as well as prioritizing education. And then the third was that they worked on equal pay for men and women, something that we've solved today thanks to the Equal Pay Act of 1963. People don't usually like to sit around. Now, I'm not talking about sitting and doing something like watching TV or video games or being on your phone. I mean literally sitting and doing nothing at all. When too many people sit and do nothing, they tend to get antsy and they need to do something. And if there are enough of these people, they often form protests. And these protests, if there's enough people that aren't maybe thinking the way that they should be, will form riots. And one of the most infamous riots of this time period was the Haymarket riot. It actually took place in Chicago. The workers went on strike and decided to protest. During the protest, an anarchist decided that it would be a good idea to test out his homemade bomb, and boom, literally, a bomb exploded and killed a crowd of people, or killed many people in the crowd. Anarchists tend not to be people who are very nice. But there was unrest with what the government was doing. Some people believed that it was the government's job to step in and fix these businesses, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act. That was the government stepping in and working on these businesses. Some believed that they needed to create regulations on businesses. Some of the future regulations would be good and some not so much. When government regulates products or when they control businesses, we call that socialism. Socialism is a mild form of communism in which the government provides for its people. You know, the government has started sending electronic checks to Americans' bank accounts. This is good and bad. It's good that Americans have a little bit of extra money to spend, but now some people will depend more on the government. They'll say to themselves, you know, I got money once, I should get money again. Others won't spend that money at all, and instead they'll save it. This means that more money gets printed, and was supposed to be spent, but instead it's being saved. Now that money's in the network, which means there's more of it, which creates inflation. So it's difficult to say whether it's good or bad, but ultimately there was this move towards socialism during the 1900s, especially during the progressive era, and some of it, as I mentioned before, was good and others not so much. Anyways, you had changes within scientific society as well as social society. You know, Darwin's Origin of Species had come out, and the philosophy of Darwinism, within nature that is, survival of the fittest, was becoming more appealing to people. Society was rapidly changing. They no longer wanted to hear somebody say, hey, there's something supernatural that you can't see, that you can't experience, or you need to be able to experience. And that's what really was being pushed, and thus evolution starts to grow, or empiricism, the idea that all that you can trust is your senses. Unfortunately, some of these social changes included black codes turning into what are called Jim Crow laws. These are laws that specifically dealt with blacks as well as whites, or sometimes it was whites and Asians, and specifically them being segregated. In California, for example, a school wanted to have an all-Asian school versus an all-white school. In the South, it wasn't Asians and whites, but instead it was blacks. They had specific drinking fountains, places that you could sit on the bus, schools that you could go to, restaurants that you could go in. There was this need. People wanted segregation in America, although segregation wasn't something that was good. They even went to court over it. In the court case Plessy versus Ferguson, there was a famous phrase. This phrase is separate but equal. It's the idea that, you know what, we are allowed to have people groups that are separate based on a physical characteristic, but they just need to be equal. It sounds like it's not such a bad idea, but ultimately just creates a society of unrest as well as inequality or inequality. So who was fighting against it? Well, there were a bunch of people that were fighting against it. One of them was actually the President of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt. But we're not going to talk about him until we get to the progressive area. One of the people that stood up was Booker T. Washington. Now, we've already mentioned him, and we talked about him, and we read part of his book. But as an adult, he turned out to be quite the American citizen. He founded the Tuskegee Institute for African Americans, where they focused on when we graduate, what will we be able to do with our lives? Will we be able to farm? Will we be able to work in construction? Will we be able to fit into a factory? He also became one of the most famous orators during his time period. He believed that even though blacks didn't have the same rights as white people, that they shouldn't focus on that. Instead, what they should focus on was their own society, their own self-improvement. Once they can become educated, once they can get out of the slums, once they can become independent from those that are around them, then the rights that they so longed for would be given them. They could not be denied from them. Teddy Roosevelt, as President of the United States, actually invited Booker T. Washington to eat with them, and he was one of the first presidents to really be interacting with African Americans. Another activist by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois had a little bit of a different opinion. You see, while Booker T. Washington said, focus on self-improvement and then we'll get those rights that we so long for, W.E.B. Du Bois said, let's focus on those rights and then we can focus on self-improvement later. He was also the first African American to graduate Harvard with his PhD, but he believed that the improvement of black treatment would also be an improvement to black society. How can they be equal without the representation they so longed for? There was these two differing opinions that were trying to reach the same goal. Each of them had things that were good, and depending on what philosophy you believe in regards to people, would decide which of these two guys you agree with the most. Literature was also changing during this time period. Some of the famous literary works were being created, like Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn, and they were created by Mark Twain. That was actually just his pseudonym. Hopefully you guys remember what a pseudonym is. But his real name was Samuel Clemens. And really his goal was to be realistic. This is portray life how it should be or how it actually is, which sometimes is boring or ordinary. Sometimes it's destitute or saddening. I like to look at myself as a realist. What do I think that life actually is? I don't look at or focus on the negatives or the positives, but instead somewhere in between. You also had another literary idea which became very popular during this time period, known as naturalism. Naturalism emphasized man's helplessness and struggle, focusing on different areas. You should definitely have heard of this within literary class. Maybe it's man versus man, maybe it's man versus nature, or maybe it's man versus himself. Books like the Red Badge of Courage focused on man versus man, whereas books like Call of the Wild focused on man versus himself as well as man versus nature. And then lastly, we have a change within religion as well. No, not in what they taught or how they were saying it, but instead in how they were doing it. Citywide campaigns, passing out tracts, street preaching. The leader of this movement is D.L. Moody, and it's known as urban evangelism today. But that's all that we have time for. I hope that you guys enjoyed. If you have any questions, please send me an email. You are dismissed.